We have to live up to that billing. So today we're going to cover something that I don't think we've covered in here in the past, but in my opinion, it's one of the most important talks that I give, and I'm always excited to present this material to anybody who will actually come and listen to it. So we want to do, as it says on the screen, develop today an organism-focused theory of biological design, and why that is important will come out during the talk. Now, I know there's some here who are really technophiles, and all of this information that I'm discussing today was presented at the International Conference on Creationism last summer. And in order to present, you have to write a paper, a peer-reviewed paper, and get that reviewed and published, and it's published in the proceedings. So the link for that, for those people who are interested to get that paper, it's quite long, but it gives a lot more information than I'm able to cover during this time, and you're able to download this. So this information has all been peer-reviewed and discussed in the past. As I mentioned yesterday, but for those who are fresh here today, we have a sign-up sheet for our free news magazine, Acts and Facts, and I don't have time this morning to really pump it up. Maybe this afternoon I'll talk a little bit more about that, but it's free. It's absolutely free, and Dr. Clary mentioned it last night that we have donors who want everybody to get this, so please sign up for that. And we're also on this type of social media. I don't see a lot of people who appear to be these media files out here, but when I go to college campuses, they recognize immediately what those things mean. But I really don't know what they really are. In fact, my slide is out of date. I found out that that is not even the right, that isn't even the right icon anymore. It looks more like an X, like I'm saying right there. So we're also on all of this type of social media. Launching right in then, 2 quick questions for all of you. Are you interested in current biological research? I'm not talking about stuff that's 40 years old. I'm talking about things that are coming out today that we're able to find and discuss today. Are you interested in that type of biological research? I hope that you are. And 2, are you totally open to fresh ideas, fresh thinking, a new way of looking at things? So if you like biology and you're not closed-minded and you're willing to consider new ways of discussing things, then today your understanding of biology could be radically changed. In other words, you will look back years from now and you will say, I remember the day I sat in the auditorium in Medora and it was cold in there. And that may be the only thing you'll remember, but I could hang meat in that place and it would stay fresh there. And there was something else happening, but I don't remember what that was. But hopefully you will say, I remember the day when I started thinking about creatures differently for the rest of my life. And that's a tall order. Today, you can start thinking about your creatures, whatever it is, differently for the rest of your life. So we want to go right into understanding engineered creatures. And I'm going to go into reasons why they are engineered, how you know they're engineered, the criteria for all of those kinds of things. So we want to understand these engineered creatures in 5 easy steps. Now, that may be a little bit of an exaggeration. Some of the steps aren't super easy, but I mean, who wants to begin a talk by saying 5 hard steps? I mean, it's like, nobody's going to listen to that. So if I tell you they're easy, you'll say, well, that's really easy. Easy, number 1 is easy. Abandon. We want to abandon. Leave behind once and for all accommodations with Darwinian selectionism. It made no sense when it was originally published. The scientists who were contemporaries of Darwinists almost universally rejected it right off. The head of the French Academy of Sciences called it silly personifications. And how it ever took hold, I'm not exactly sure, except for the fact that it is the unbeliever's explanation for why creatures look incredibly designed. And we need to move. We need to move from Darwin and it's really a way of looking at the world, a way of thinking. So it's really Darwinism back to engineered biology, because prior to Darwin, people would look at creatures and they thought that they were highly engineered, that they were clearly designed. So the future is back. It's not back to the future. The future is going back to the way things were before Darwin. And the way things were before Darwin, by and large, were dominated by the idea that creatures look engineered because they were engineered. That was just the assumption, and that's how we can look at it today. I mean, creatures do look incredibly engineered. The man that you see on the screen there, William Paley, he published a book in 1803, Natural Theology. It's still in print. You can still get it. He discussed many, many ways and the similarities between human-engineered things and God-engineered things in terms of his creatures, and he was able to put them together. We need to move back and away from what our current thinking is, and today's status quo, almost universally accepted, is that Darwin's mechanism was right. The way Darwin described it was right. Evolutionists think it was right, and creationists have been saying for many, many years that it was right. Even our ministry was saying that it was right. But we were wrong. It isn't right. It never was right. There's not really hardly anything about his concepts or his thinking that is even close to right. But we would say, but it can't do everything he claims, or he claims more for it than it can actually produce. So we're basically saying his view of creatures is right, but it can't get to where he wants you to go. What I'm saying is his view of creatures is wrong. It's fundamentally wrong. It's misleadingly wrong. And you can't get anywhere by saying that it's right. So throughout this talk, we're going to use an organism that is going to be our model to discuss. And I discussed it last night. It's the cave fish. And that's why we work on these fish at ICR. What you see up on the screen are just two different pictures of groups. You'll see a sided pigmented fish on the left, and then you see a kind of like a pinkish blind fish below it. And there's just two groups. As I mentioned last night, there's literally hundreds of different types of fish that when they find themselves in a cave, they can go blind. But the one that we're looking at here is the one that's researched most often. It's called Astyanax. So people have known about these for hundreds of years, and they've been studying them closely for well over 100 years. So what is the conventional explanation of how these fish got the way they are? Let's look what a museum says. All of us have been to a museum, so you go to the museum, they show the picture of the cave fish, and then boom, along the side of it is the explanation, what they want you to learn about it. And this is what an exhibit on cave fish describes. I'm going to read it to you. It's a little long, but you'll get the salient points as I go through it. As genetic information is copied and passed on from generation to generation, and we know how that happens, it's copied and it's put into the gametes, egg or sperm, and it gets passed on from generation to generation. Occasionally, there are copying mistakes known as mutations. That's a key point because evolutionists say mutation can just mean any type of change in DNA, whether it's mistaken or purposeful. But the common view in everybody's mind is that mutations are mistakes and you don't want them. And the reason why it's in everybody's mind is because every museum and every television show that talks about them is referring to mutations as mistakes, as copying mistakes or some other kind of mistake. Mutations have been observed to destroy, damage, or corrupt genetic information or to be neutral, but have never been observed to add new information. This is true of even so-called beneficial mutations, mutations that may be advantageous to the surviving organisms in some circumstances. When a mutation occurs in a light environment that causes animals' offsprings not to have eyes, it is an enormous disadvantage. So natural selection eliminates this flaw. When the eyeless defect occurs here, that is in a cave, it does not give any disadvantage, so it is not eliminated. In fact, it gives advantages. Those with eyes can crash into things, injuring the eyes, and can get diseases of the eyes, possibly leading to death. Eventually, selective pressures ensure that all are eyeless. These ghostly fish are prime examples of how mutation and natural selection can lead to a reduction of functioning systems These adaptations are no evidence at all for the belief that complexity can arise by such processes. They only show how information can be lost in a fallen world. And that explanation was given by ICR. That is our explanation. That is our original explanation, and it was in our original museum of how these blind cavefish came to be. So if we were to sum this all up, what I would call a theistic selectionist view is that creationists claim that the surface-dwelling ancestors gradually morphed into these cave forms due to random genetic mutations which led to broken systems, the systems to make eyes or pigmentation, through a purposeless trial and error process of death and survival, which they call natural selection, that results in loss of information, depigmentation, and blindness, and eventually selection pressures ensure all are eyeless. Now, when you're reading that, if you have your thinking cap on, you would be asking yourself, now wait, how is anything they just said different from how an evolutionist would describe it? How is it different in one single iota? And the answer is, it's not. It's not different at all. And the reason why this was never a formidable response against Darwinian evolution is because it is Darwinian evolution. And we would put this little caveat in, as all that shows is how you can break something but not make something. That's your pushback? It shows how you break eyes but not make eyes, and evolutionists have to show us how to make eyes? Really? Well, let me ask you this. Did anything I read, did it lift high the name of Jesus? Did it glorify him in any way? Does it show that his mechanism of adaptation is glorious? Or does it show that the mechanism that we were teaching people for adaptation is just as death-driven and just as clunky and just as messed up as any evolutionist would say? And I'll tell you a reason why they put together that scenario for adaptation is because mutations being fractioned out by a struggle to survive and a hit and miss process due to random changes in the environment and random changes in mutation is so messed up, it is so clunky that no reasonable, thoughtful engineer would ever do it that way. Maybe they wanted people to think that no reasonable, thoughtful engineer would have ever done it that way. Maybe they baked right into it its anti-design thinking right from the get-go. And when we copied that, we copied the anti-design explanation right from the get-go. Well, there's some major problems to this, and there are some major harms. First of all, it derails scientific research in that it never got us looking for non-random processes. I mean, that's a bad deal if you claim to be a design-based organization and you're not looking for anything that's design-based. Derail scientific for not looking for the non-broken. Mutations for adaptation, as I said, no rational engineer would use them, therefore no thinking God would ever use them. At least that's what I would conclude. Theistic selectionism is just a lighter version of real evolution. Can we do better? The answer is yes, we can do a whole lot better. So number one is abandon that junk, get rid of it, don't go back to it, don't go back to selection pressures, don't go back to any of this stuff. And embrace something completely new. Embrace a new approach to biological research that's based on and accepts observable engineered workmanship that we see in creatures. And primarily two things that need to be explained. Purpose. Everything on you has a purpose. In fact, everything on you has multiple purposes. I can't think of a single feature, and Dr. Porton is over here as well, and he deals with animals. And he may not have thought of this, but if I were to challenge him, there's probably not a single feature on any animal which serves a single purpose. Everything on you, eyes, skin, kidneys, heart, blood cells. They all serve not a purpose, but multiple purposes simultaneously. And they all serve those purposes in a highly integrated, interrelated fashion. And number two, it's agency. Right now, I'm operating with agency. You operate with agency. Animals operate with agency. We exercise agency. We exercise volition. We want to do things. How do you explain that? Not only that, when you look at creatures, it looks like we were built by a thinking agent. So the fact that we're built by an agent and we exercise agency, you're going to tell me all of this agency we see came about via no agency? You're going to tell me all the purpose we see came about through purposeless random processes? These make no sense, but there's a reason for them saying it. So the first question we would have are there any biblical indicators? Are there any biblical indicators for why we should look at creatures from an engineered perspective or from a design perspective? Well, they're abundant. As I mentioned last night in Psalm 19, verse 1, it says, the heavens declare the glory of God. And again, it's one of those verses where we always stop too short. It says, but the firmament shows his handiwork. Psalm 8, verse 3 to 6, it says, the cosmos is the work of your fingers, and he made humans to have dominion over the work of your hands. Psalm 9, verse 5, the Lord speaks of his sovereignty, of which his hands have formed. Psalm 102, verse 25, God laid the foundations of the earth, and the heavens are the work of your hands. 143, 5, I meditate on all your works, I muse and ponder the work of your hands. And I mentioned last night in Romans chapter 1, verse 20, it says, invisible things of him from the creation of the world are clearly seen, being understood by the things that are made. The Greek word translated made there is used only one other time in Ephesians chapter 2, verse 10, where it says we are his workmanship. Wow. How many times does the Lord have to kind of like be hitting us over the head? And he said, now when you look at creatures, you're looking at handiwork. You're looking at workmanship. And he expects us to know what he is talking about. And the only way we know what workmanship and handiwork are is we study what we have done with our hands and our workmanship. He knows we know what workmanship is because every culture that has ever lived on this planet does it. Every culture that has ever been here makes things. Every culture that has ever existed on this planet knows that things don't make themselves. And so every one of us in this room has engineered something in our lives, and we have fabricated at least something at one time in our lives. So the Lord says, you know what handiwork is, and you are it. You are handiwork. And so how in the world does that help us? Well, maybe this isn't figurative language at all, and maybe we should be setting up our experiments, and maybe we should be setting up our way of investigating living things to be looking specifically for the characteristics and evidences of real handiwork. And when you look, you see them in abundance. When you used to be able to take engines apart and put them back together in a day, you could lift up the hood and you could watch a running engine. It wasn't covered up with a bunch of plastic. And when you could see those kinds of engines, you saw evidences of handiwork and abundance. You saw numerous interconnected parts or numerous parts working together for a purpose. Even this little clicker has numerous parts working together for a purpose. When you see this, it doesn't happen by chance. There's only one cause of this: intelligence. And when you see me, you see multiple, incredible, glorious parts working together for a purpose. I mean, there you go. Praise the Lord. On that, hey, you have a good fan too. I expected my wife to be saying amen. He's got great parts on all of that. But you look at all the creatures. Look at all the creatures. And they all have wonderful parts working together for purpose. As it says there, particular arrangement, proper alignment, moving parts, precise timing, exact dimensions and fit. There's an exact order that you have to put them together. When you see all of these things, you're seeing evidences of workmanship. When you start looking at creatures, what you see is evidence of workmanship in abundance. And when you get down to the molecular level inside cells, you see tiny little robots that move around. You see machinery which can cut DNA, move parts, move it around. You see little railroad tracks which are able to deliver things inside the cell, where they kind of like lay down the track in front of them, like a mobile machine goes and it carries something along to the cell and it's picking up the track behind it. You see intracellular elevators. You see things which splice stuff together, rivets, welds. You see all of these features of creatures of man-made workmanship inside of them. You see supports, you see scaffolding. You see temporary scaffolding that's put up temporarily and taken down again. You see tiny little molecular machines, such as little molecular motors which can turn things and run on electrons. And you see other little generators which also have spinning parts which build up energy and take glucose and oxygen, and they spin these things together, and boom, you pump things up to a high energy state, all to just use it again. You see incredible evidences of engineering everywhere, not just at the large scale, but all the way down to the molecular scale. And words are really important. Words are highly important because words, the words you use to describe the things that I was just talking about, characterize where they came from. They're indicators of how they originated on all of those things. They convey these ideas of origins. So if we were to look at the literature, the scientific literature, and we were to play this game, the Family Feud game, and I were to ask you to guess the top 8 words that are indicators of design, word number 1 would be purposeful. Purposeful. That is overwhelming it. So when you look at the scientific literature and when you look at engineering literature, you see words like purposeful. You see words like regulated, complex, targeted, orderly, specified, fitting or suitable, and precise. These are words which are indicators of design. If we were to go through evolutionary literature, you would see words that are just the exact opposite. You would see them describing creatures as random, broken, cobbled together, a work of tinkering, trial and error, hit and miss. And so they are picking words to describe creatures which, 1, are not accurate. 2, they're totally imaginative. They don't know whether these things are random. They don't know whether it's trial and error. They just imagine these things are hit and miss. But 3, and this is most important, they're picking words which are the exact opposite of what we would use to describe purposeful, thoughtful engineering. They are picking words which to convey the exact opposite of that. That's because they know that design-based explanations are theistic explanations, and they know explanations which are anti-design are by their very nature and by definition anti-theistic. So they have a vested goal to get in everybody's mind in junior high school, and college, that what you're seeing is clunky, random, hit and miss, trial and error, tinkered, so that nobody is putting in their mind that this thing was designed, and if it wasn't designed, it's anti-theistic. Does that make sense? So they don't have to say a word about God. This is important. Darwin doesn't have to come out and say there is no God. Darwin doesn't have to come out and say God is dead. All he has to do is present a way for you to look at creatures, to think about creatures, that they are the product of a totally mindless, clunky process that, 1, you will not even be thinking of God because it would make no sense if God would do this. And two, he comes up with a process where he says nature can do everything that God can do, so there probably isn't any need for God. So he gets people thinking there's no need for him and he wouldn't do it this way anyway. So he changes people's view about God by changing the way people think about his creatures. Without ever having to come out and say there is no God, people just come to that conclusion themselves. But in utter contrast, in the absolute contrast to that, this is what general revelation is in the Bible. The engineered workmanship that we really see in creatures that corresponds to the engineered workmanship that we see in man-made things is the primary and undeniable revelation of Jesus's power, wisdom, and genius. Power, he can do it. He can do it at the microscopic level, he can do it at the major level. His genius, he can put together these kinds of systems and they all work together. His wisdom, there's all kinds of competing needs and he solves them perfectly. He balances, optimizes everything perfectly. He is utterly and totally wise. We see it because they correspond to man-made things. They correspond to man-made things, but they're just so much better. They're better. But in terms of how they operate like man-made things. They just do it better. Step number 3, develop a new theory of biological design. A new theory. What is a theory? Well, Dr. Horton just mentioned it. It's a working hypothesis. It's a way you think about how things work. In many ways, it's a story. It's a narrative. Darwin came up with a narrative. This is how I think organisms came into being. This is how I think they took on the appearance of design. This is how I think they diversified into all the different types of creatures we have. And he develops a story. And everybody is taught that story. And once you're taught that story, then you think the way he thinks about creatures. And theory is to lead people to think in a certain way. So it's a working hypothesis that connects observations. Oh, I see all these diverse creatures. And you start to build a story. But it's supposed to formulate research questions. And this is the biggie. It interprets your observations and it helps explains how things work. So this gentleman right here, Paul Nelson, Dr. Paul Nelson, he came up with this quote, and I wish I would have said it myself. We need to do biology as if Darwin had not been born. He said never been born, but I softened it by saying not been born. That means no Darwin. How would we be thinking about biology today? How would we be thinking about it today? Well, here's the major shift that I'm proposing. You have the realm of engineering and then you have the realm of biology, and most people see them as two separate realms, and there's a good reason why we kind of see biology here and engineering is here, but I'm going to argue that they have a lot in common, a lot more in common than people generally think. So engineering principles are the best practices. They're the things that you've learned. They're the things that guide on how we build stuff. Here's an engineering principle. You start with a building like this with the foundation first and you go upwards, not the other way around. That's an engineering principle. Boom, 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 boom. You start with engineering principles about what you want the foundation to be like, what you want those beams to be like, and things like this. So engineering principles guide how things work. You use them. Everybody uses them. Even if you're not an engineer, you know how to do something. And those are engineering principles, and they guide how things work. Now, biology has functions. All creatures grow. All creatures reproduce. All creatures adapt. And all creatures metabolize. Metabolize means you take things from your environment, you build yourself up with them, you turn them to energy. That's metabolism. All creatures do those things. And all creatures seem to have consciousness. I'm talking about bacteria. I don't know whether you would say that they per se are conscious, but they seem to exercise a type of volition, and even bacteria can learn. It's quite remarkable. You think of bacteria, you can train it. Yes, you can see it in the lab. You can train these bacteria. So even bacteria exercise a type of agency. So what things can be explained by engineering? Well, maybe how organisms metabolize, that might be explained by engineering. How they adapt might be able to. But how they grow or reproduce generally isn't thought of that way, but that's incorrect. Engineers, it would be hard, but engineers could design a thing which could gather resources together, build them up, and reproduce itself. Engineers could design that. Engineers could design something that would grow. Engineers, what it would show is how complex and how hard it is to do this, but they could do those things. So in terms of the biological functions, engineering can actually explain all of them. So this is a way I would suggest that we should look at biology. Biology, in terms of the biological functions, explaining adaptation and growth and things like that, all of that can be rolled into the realm of engineering. So you would have civil engineering, mechanical engineering, electrical engineering, and you would have biological engineering, which everybody already knows is there. And engineering is used to explain the biological functions. Engineering principles will explain them, and I'm going to suggest that if you want to come to a correct explanation of biological functions, if you're not in the realm of engineering, you're not going to be on the right track. You're not even going to be close to the right track. If you want to explain how this is functioning, you better get into the realm of engineering. And that's the only way you're going to get on the right track towards explanations. On the other hand, things like consciousness, agency, or life itself, that cannot be explained by engineering principles, nor can it be explained by my biological functions. In other words, my biological functions are not producing the real Randy. My biological functions are not producing life. Life is separate from my biological functions. And when my biological functions stop one of these days, the real Randy doesn't. The real Randy continues on. And that you cannot quantify life. So if I were to ask someone over here, pointing indiscriminately, hand me a beaker of life. Give me some life. Nobody can put it in a beaker. If I were to ask someone over here, hand me a cubic foot of your thoughts. You can't. You can't quantify those thoughts because they're immaterial. Thoughts are immaterial. Life is immaterial. Evolutionists see everything from a material way. They see this. They see my heart is pumping blood to keep my brain alive. My brain generates my thoughts. My neurons acting together are generating my thoughts. They don't know how that works, but they believe it. I would argue it's the exact opposite. The real Randy right now is generating thoughts from the immaterial realm. They get activated through my brain. And then my brain operates my vocal cords. I compress the air. If compressed air travels across the room, hits your tympanic membranes, vibrates that, gets decoded in your brain, and then goes into the realm of your thoughts. So I transfer my thoughts to your thoughts through the material realm, but they're immaterial because everything that I just said to you was transferred to you. But if I could have weighed your brain before I started talking and I could weigh your brain now, it hasn't changed one little bit. But you've gained all this information. Does this make sense? So my thoughts are generating these things. My thoughts are activating my brain. My brain is acting like an interface that connects the real Randy to this material realm. And when my kidneys die out or my heart dies out and my brain no longer functions, my connection to this physical world is over, but the real Randy is not. So, you can't explain the real Randy by biological functions. You can't explain it by engineering principles. So hold it out and don't even try. You're not going to get there. And even if I could make a machine that could reproduce itself, it's not like a dog. It's not like a real dog or a cat. Which means then that we need to build some new models. Models are almost like hypotheses. They're ways to explain how we think something might work as well, but on a more narrow or limited sense. We could build a model for metabolism. So I'm suggesting right off the bat, let's build a model for adaptation. Because adaptation is the name of the game. If organisms could not adapt, if organisms could not change with the changes in the environment around them, then a theory of evolution could never get going. Because if they were as static as this podium right here, it can't evolve. But organisms can change, organisms can adapt, and therefore someone can extrapolate that organisms maybe can change a whole lot over a really, really long period of time under the omnipotent hand of natural selection. And so research, as I mentioned last night, is actually describing adaptation in ways which are indicative of engineering in a highly engineered way. And these are the words that you find in technical papers describing adaptation. Regulated, rapid, repeatable, reversible, sometimes, not always, but sometimes reversible, and with targeted responses that are so targeted they're even predictable. In just a few moments, I'll give you some examples of that. So I would hypothesize that what organisms seem to be able to do is track along with changing environments. When the environment changes, they have a way to detect it, and they can track these changing environments within design parameters. Within design parameters. In other words, it's not unlimited. What's a design parameter? Well, your chair. The chair you're sitting on has a design parameter. It will hold weight up to a certain amount. But every one of us knows if we put 14 tons on your chair, it will fail. It'll crush. You just exceeded its design parameter. So everything can operate within a parameter. If I put 14 tons on your chair and it failed, would that mean that your chair was poorly designed? No. It just meant I exceeded what it was built to do. So organisms can operate, they can adapt, but within parameters. The parameters are pretty impressive, but they're not unlimited. They're not unlimited by all. Oh, go back here. And how they do it, in this, I put it in big red, is through many innate systems. What that is saying is quit thinking about your genes alone. Everybody talks about the genes. I got the genes for this. I got the genes for that. I got the smart gene. Unfortunately, I got the dumb gene. You know, everybody's talking about the gene. Genes are important. There's no doubt about it. But there are other mechanisms which lead to adaptation which are not working through the genes. So the Lord built together many, many different mechanisms. And in order to build a model, you put these things together, you go to scientific meetings, you present your material, you wonder if people who are your peers think this is reasonable or if they think it's crazy. And we have put this together and presented it now many, many, many times. And it's pretty strong and pretty robust so far that organisms seem to be able to track along with the different environmental changes. And so CET primarily, it was a major distinction from CET from evolutionary thinking, is instead of focusing on the environment, we focus on the organism. Why? Because anything that an engineer designs is the entity, and you build into the entity all properties which will regulate it. That's called internalism. So internalism would speculate that within organisms, all operations, not 99%, but all operations are controlled by identifiable control systems. Here's a prediction. I'm giving a hypothesis and I'm giving you a prediction at the same time. I'm saying cat, dog, human, whatever you're seeing, whatever is what's operating on that organism, whatever they're doing at that time, however they're metabolizing their dog food and turning it into energy, I should be able to look inside that creature and identify the control system which is regulating that. Does that make sense? It will be there, is what I'm saying. And I'm saying it's in here, not out there. That's internalistic. Look inside to find the design. The organism as a whole, not just the genes, the organism as a whole is the directing program. Internal form and adaptability are all governed by innate systems. Innate systems. And adaptability, here's a definition. So when people are talking, what are you talking about? I'm saying adaptability is the engineered control of the organism-environment interface by the organism. My systems that are built into me determine how I will respond to everything outside of me, not the other way around. And I, within my design parameters, will express appropriate self-adjustments to what's happening internally and externally within my design parameters. In other words, the organism, just like any engineered thing, is in control. It's in control of what's happening. So, CET focuses on the organism. You want to explain what's happening? Get your eyes off of the environment, start focusing on the organism, and start looking and digging inside the organism, and you will find the answer there. You will find the answer there to what it's able to do. And number two, when you find that answer, you will be able to explain it by engineering principles, because organisms don't operate by magic, and how they will operate will be an expression of some engineering-based way of doing it. It won't get around engineering. The Lord could have made it so that we couldn't be explained by engineering, but he didn't. He says, I want you to know that these things are engineered, so when you dig into them, they're going to operate by these engineering principles, and you're going to have a really hard time to say they weren't engineered. Because they're going to operate by the same principles that your stuff operates by. Hey, my arms are moving in mechanical fashions just like the arms on a backhoe. Engineering principles. You see them everywhere. You see them everywhere. And therefore, you should be able to expect to find corresponding system elements. What do I mean by that? Well, that car that you see on the left-hand side of the screen there, it can drive itself. It's a totally automated car. There's no driver in it. If you put enough fuel in, it could go from Seattle to Orlando all by itself, driving around storms and traffic jams and things like that there. That's because you see all over it a bunch of sensors, and it's packed with computers that take the information it gathers from the outside, processes it, and responds appropriately. I'm saying organisms have sensors that they have built in logic, and they respond appropriately. So on the right-hand side of the screen, you see guinea pigs beat climate change by tweaking their own DNA. Now, brothers and sisters, don't get focused on climate change. Those are like little red herrings. Whether it's there or not, focus in on the fact that it tweaks its own DNA. That's the cool thing. Don't let them get like, climate change, and shut down mentally. Focus on the fact that it says it tweaks its own DNA. Now you should be saying, how in the world does it do that? Well, they took these male guinea pigs, they put them in a cage, they put a heating pad under the cage to ramp it up like they think climate change is going to do. Now anybody who knows male guinea pig anatomy knows what's sitting on the heating pad right there. And they ran that baby for 70 days, because it takes 70 days to go from a stem cell to a functioning mature sperm cell. They mated these male guinea pigs with female guinea pigs who weren't cooked. And then they checked the pups. They checked the dads and the pups. And dads and the pups already were expressing through at least 18 different genes, which are related to heat regulation, different features. Bang, just like that. One generation. They're able to live in hotter climates that quickly. Now that's pretty cool, isn't it? I guarantee you there's a heat sensor. It's somewhere on that guinea pig. It's there. See, this is how science works. I predict there's a heat sensor. I predict that guinea pig doesn't operate by magic. That if it's heated up, it knows it. It has a sensor. I predict that data that guinea pig is picking up from the hot is being sent inward somewhere, somehow, and it's manipulating the expression of those genes on those sperm while they're being developed. I predict that. You know why I predict it? Because it's not magic, and it has to operate that way. I predict there's a sensor. I predict there's a mechanism to control this expression. Does this make sense? And this is how science should work. And it makes sense. And it can be tracked on those things. And I predict the engineered capability to adjust to that temperature is not due to sitting on a heating pad. It existed in that guinea pig before it sat on the heating pad. It was there in advance because that's how engineers do these kinds of things. So let's look at how this might work. If I'm predicting that there's sensors and there's logic and they should have a suitable response, when different creatures detect similar conditions, if they have similar programming, I predict they'll have a similar response. So here's the cave. That's the condition. What if these organisms, none of this happened randomly, what if they were programmed to lose their eyes, lose their pigmentation, change their circadian rhythms, and augment all the other senses that they're going to need to live in their cave? What if they were also programmed to change their red blood cells, change their metabolism, change the shape of their skull, change the way they mate in the dark? Try that. I mean, really, you're two blind fish, blind male, blind female. How do you even get together? Not only do they get together, they find each other and they swim in a unified fashion, totally blind, like two planes flying in formation. And at just the right time, she swims upside down, releases her eggs. At that moment, the male flips over, releases the sperm into the water, both activated once they touch each other and once they touch the water. She flips over and they swim away. Huh. Blind. But they do it. Maybe they would have come up with similar responses, and that's why you would find blind cavefish, blind salamanders, blind crickets, blind spiders, blind crustaceans. You'd find all kinds of creatures which can do this similar thing. Maybe you would find creatures which can change in this way. You see the beetle on the left, and you see those ants on the right, the brown beetle and the ants. But those aren't ants, those are beetles. Those beetles can morph into looking like ants when they find themselves in the presence of army ants, which would normally eat the beetles. So what you see on the screen there's the army ant, and this is what the beetle now looks like. So the beetle kind of looks like an army ant, smells like an army. It changes its shape so that it can coexist with these army ants. And they can not only do it with one species of army ants, they can change the shape to look like 9 different species of army ant. That ability to do that is internal. That ability to do it preceded the exposure to the army ants, not due to the exposure to the army ants. Does that make sense? So this is what the paper said. They proposed that the beetles were poised for myrmecophilia, that means to become ant-like, and that this near clade-wide pre-adaptive ground plan may underlie the repeated ant mimicry. When was evolution supposed to have anything poised? This article says, speaking on all of this, The discovery published in Current Biology provides evidence that evolution has the capacity to repeat itself in an astonishingly predictable way. Wow, that's quite remarkable that they did all these things. Here's other research on these spiders, Hawaiian stick spiders. You have a gold type of spider which lives on leaves. You have a brown one which lives on tree trunks. You have a white one which lives on lichen. They found that per se, a gold one, which would go from one Hawaiian island to another Hawaiian island, could change into the brown and white morphs before a brown and a white one ever got to the other island. It could change rapidly. And they said this, quote, "We don't usually expect evolution to be predictable, but Hawaiian stick spiders of the Aramnis genus have repeatedly evolved the same distinctive forms known as ecomorphs on different islands." She said, and this was a gal who was doing the research, the spiders, quote, "arrive on an island and boom, you get independent evolution to the same set of forms, this sort of rapid and repeated evolution." She went on to say, we can ask whether there might be an underlying mechanism, that leads to the similar patterns of predictively repeated evolution in the course of adaptive evolution, radiation there, that the Aramnis spiders have some sort of pre-programmed switch in their DNA that can be quickly turned on to allow them to evolve rapidly into these successful forms. But how this process might work is still unclear. Let me suggest you start looking for sensors. Let me suggest you start looking for internal logic and output responses. Because it's not magic, they will be there. They will be there. They will operate by engineering principles, and they will not operate by magic. This man right here, Jonathan Losos, he's the world's leading researcher on those anole lizards, and he does some really good, precise work, and he studies them on the Caribbean islands. And he does some interesting experiments, and this is one on some islands where lizards with really short legs were living. And he had discovered, as his research on the islands are, that islands with vegetation that was small, almost like sagebrush, like vegetation, that the lizards had short legs. And that other islands that had big, tall trees, the lizards that were living on the trees had long legs, long for crawling on the trees. Well, a hurricane came through and killed all the lizards on 7 islands. And all the islands had short little scrub brush-like vegetation. So interestingly, he went and got lizards from islands with the tall trees, the long-legged lizards. And he got a bunch of those lizards, and he put them on all the 7 islands with the short vegetation, and he wanted to see what would happen. And he said this, our prediction was that they would evolve shorter legs. And they did. Over the course of 4 million years, average length, not 4 million years, over the course of 4 years, 4. Average limb length steadily declined on all 7 islands, exactly as predicted. All 7 islands were evolving in lockstep. How do you get all of that to happen the same way if there isn't some programming to control this and to do it? That leads to these kinds of things. Here's some researchers. This is Nature's, the world's leading scientific journal. Look at this headline. Predictable evolution trumps randomness of mutation. Some people are hoping Trump will trump something anyway. I can tell that. But wait a second here. That whole headline from an evolutionary standpoint makes no sense. Predictable? Was evolution ever supposed to be predictable? Nope. Was it supposed to trump randomness? Nope. What they did is they had separate colonies of E. coli bacteria, separate colonies. They exposed all of these colonies to identical conditions, and then they sequenced the DNA, and sure enough, they were all changing identically, genetically identically, exposed to these same conditions. They went on to say this, although mutations, the driver of evolution, stop right there. They don't know that mutations are the driver of evolution. And the very next sentence that they say are random. they don't know that they're random. They don't do a test to say, oh, this is random. They don't have a test to say that it's random. Those are assumptions. Those are assumptions of their theory. Mutations are random. That's not factual-based things. That's how they believe it works, and they say it like a mantra as if it's a fact. Although the mutations occur at random, their study of bacteria E. coli, reveals that nature often finds the same solution. Oh, stop right there. That's a personification. Nature finds the same solution. Nature now is operating like an agent. How about this? These organisms were pre-programmed to find the same solution. Does that make more scientific sense? I can actually look for that. I can't find nature doing something. The same solution, the same problem again and again. Identical mutations appeared independently in all three test tubes. They went on to say bacteria such as E. coli can acquire predictable mutations to adapt to changing environments. And what's interesting is I've called my theory continuous environmental tracking. And just a few years ago in 2022, this article came out in Science. Direct observation of adaptive tracking on ecological timescale in Drosophila. Those are fruit flies. And they took, and this was no small experiment, this was an experiment with well over 100,000 fruit flies divided up into 10 independent cages, independent settings on all of those. And they were able to track those fruit flies due to changing seasons. Just to the changes of the seasons over a 4-month period. And what they were able to find is what you see there up on the picture. That is the changes of the genome of those flies. And it was reported at Penn State, which is where the research was done, rapid adaptation in fruit flies, and this is what they found. Over the course of the experiment, which lasted 4 months, the researchers documented changes to how much of the fly's genome? 60%. 60% of the fly's genome, with this direct observation of swift and continuous adaptation in response to the environment, a phenomenon known as adaptive tracking. I think they stole my title. The biologists have established a new paradigm for how to think about the time scale of evolution. Wow, that's incredible. There it is, all blown up. I could have done that for those who had less evolved eyes in the room. And then finally, new research. Based on this new theory of biological design, based on a new model of continuous environmental tracking, conduct some new research that will help to try to support these kinds of things that we're seeing. What are the mechanisms and the systems which might lead to this, which might lead to these kinds of things that we see right there? Well, as I mentioned last night, a paper, and this is one that we're following on, was published by Rohner in 2013, which was able to document how these fish can go from sighted to blind in as little as 1 generation. Well, what about the pigmentation? And this is where we've been focusing our research on in the last several years. So you have a fish like that. That's the cave fish. If I were to take you to one scientific paper after another, they would say that the genes to make pigmentation have been broken, that random mutations broke the genes. In fact, I could show you at least 6 different papers that said the genes for pigmentation have been broken due to these random mutations. Well, if these genes are broken, if I were to take this fish and put it back in the sunlight, it would not regain its pigmentation. On the other hand, If pigmentation is a trait that can be modulated down when needed to be and modulated back up when needed to be, in other words, it can track the environment as it changes, then if I take this fish and I put it back in simulated sunlight conditions, it should regain its pigmentation. So this is the fish, and this is the fish when put back in sunlight. Well, there you go. And it did that not in 32,000 years, it did it in 32 days. 32 days. Here's the male that looked just like that. So what can we offer evolutionists? What can we offer to replace all of these things? We can go from the non-designed random adaptive process, which is a totally externalistic, which sees organisms as passive modeling clay, being shaped by their environment, where adaptation is characterized as completely undirected, hit and miss, trial and error, due to iterative, gradual, and linear changes, or as Darwin called it, numerous successive slight modifications. This is the world we live in. This is the world even creationists live in. Let's replace it with something that is much more reasonable, designed and purposeful adaptations, where we look inside the creatures for the sensors, the logic mechanisms, the output responses. We look inside them to explain what's happening. It's organism-focused and it's engineering-based, where adaptation is characterized not as undirected, but as highly regulated. Not hit and miss, but predictable and repeatable. And it can go up and down as necessary within its design parameters. We can offer a far better way of looking at creatures. So from this day forward, this is how I'd like you to change your thinking. No longer think of creatures as passive modeling clay being shaped by their environment. Dump the passive modeling clay shaped by your environment and replace it with active, problem-solving organisms that can sense their challenges, solve those challenges, and be fruitful, multiply, and fill the earth. What are they? Active, problem-solving entities. Active, problem-solving entities that sense their challenge, solve their challenge, and are fruitful, multiply, and fill the earth. And where can you get information on that? Well, as Dr. Clary mentioned, we have a book in the back, and I've written several chapters in this. This is probably our most useful all-around book, but there are many other things and resources. If you can't remember everything I said today, this would be a resource to help you with that. But please, more than anything, sign up for that Acts and Facts. It will keep you current, and we're currently even explaining this theory of biological design. So thank you for listening so attentively. Thank you for adapting to these things and let me pile all this information on you.